The whiskey-soaked laughter from the Silver Spur Saloon carried across the muddy street, but 22-year-old Evangeline Reed kept her eyes down as she hurried past with her basket of mending, knowing that one glance through those swinging doors would bring nothing but cruel words and spiteful glares from the respectable folk of Timber Creek, Montana Territory, in this year of 1876. She had been born on the wrong side of the Gallatin River, in the ramshackle collection of tents and crooked cabins where the miners, drifters, and women of ill repute made their homes, and no amount of hard work or decent living would ever wash that stain from her name in the eyes of the townspeople who lived on the East Bank. Evangeline pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders as the September wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of pine from the mountains that loomed over the valley like silent guardians. She had spent her entire life trying to prove she was more than her birthplace, more than the daughter of a saloon girl who had died when Evangeline was only 7, leaving her to be raised by an elderly widow named Mrs. Hartley, who had taken pity on the child. Mrs. Hartley had lived on the west side too, in a slightly better cabin than most, and she had taught Evangeline to read, to sew, to conduct herself like a lady despite the circumstances of her birth. But Mrs. Hartley had passed 2 winters ago, and Evangeline had been alone ever since, taking in mending and washing to keep a roof over her head in the tiny cabin that had been left to her. She crossed the wooden bridge that spanned the Gallatin River every morning to collect work from the shops on the respectable east side, and every evening she crossed back, feeling the weight of judgmental stares on her back like stones. Azert psarticidlarly difficult. Mrs. Pemberton, the banker's wife, had refused to pay for the dress Evangeline had spent 2 weeks altering, claiming the stitching was substandard even though every seam was perfect. The woman had simply wanted an excuse not to pay someone from the wrong side of the river. Evangeline had left the dress and walked out with her head high, but her stomach was growling now, and she had no idea how she would buy flour and beans for the coming week. She was so lost in her worried thoughts that she did not notice the 3 men until they stepped out from the alley beside the general store, blocking her path. Evangeline recognized them immediately as the Sawyer brothers, troublemakers who spent more time drinking than working their father's ranch. The eldest, Clayton, had a mean streak that showed in his pale eyes. Well, if it ain't the river rat herself," Clayton drawled, and his brothers snickered behind him. "Heard you been causing trouble for Mrs. Pemberton." Evangeline tried to step around them, but they moved to block her again. "I have caused no trouble. Please let me pass." "Please let me pass," one of the younger brothers mimicked in a high-pitched voice. "You hear that, Clay? She thinks she can talk proper and we will forget what she is." "I am just trying to make an honest living," Evangeline said, hating the way her voice trembled. The street was not empty, but nobody moved to help her. She saw merchants in doorways turn away, saw women hurry their children past. This was how it had always been. Clayton stepped closer, and Evangeline could smell the whiskey on his breath. "Your ma was a whore, and everyone knows the apple does not fall far from the tree. Maybe you should stop pretending to be something you are not and just accept what you are meant to be." The words struck like a physical blow, but before Evangeline could respond, before Clayton could move any closer, a shadow fell across them all. A voice like distant thunder spoke from behind the Sawyer brothers, low and carrying an edge of danger that made the hair on Evangeline's arms stand up. "The lady asked you to let her pass." The brothers turned, and Evangeline caught her first glimpse of the man who stood there. He was massive, easily 6 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulders so broad they seemed to block out the sun. His dark hair fell past his shoulders, tied back with a strip of leather, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face. He wore buckskins that were weathered but well-maintained, and a knife hung at his belt alongside what looked like a tomahawk. His eyes were the color of a storm-dark sky, and they were fixed on Clayton Sawyer with an intensity that made the younger man take an involuntary step backward. "This does not concern you, mountain man," Clayton said, but his bravado was fading fast. "We are just having a friendly conversation. Did not look friendly to me." The mountain man moved forward with a predator's grace despite his size. "Looked like three cowards cornering a woman. Now you are going to apologize to her, and then you are going to walk away." "Like hell we are," the youngest Sawyer brother spat. "You cannot come into our town and tell us what to do." The mountain man's expression did not change, but something in his stillness made all three brothers tense. "I am going to count to 3. If you are still standing here when I reach 3, we are going to have a problem." 1. Clayton looked at his brothers, then back at the mountain man. He was clearly trying to decide if his pride was worth whatever was about to happen. 2. "Fine," Clayton snapped. "She is not worth the trouble anyway." He shouldered past the mountain man, his brothers following, but he turned back to spit one final insult. "Trash from the wrong side of the river, that is all you will ever be." Evangeline flinched, wrapping her arms around herself as the Sawyer brothers disappeared down the street. She became aware suddenly that the massive stranger was looking at her, and she forced herself to meet his eyes even as her cheeks burned with humiliation. He had just witnessed her shame, heard the worst of what people said about her. "Thank you," she managed to say. "I appreciate your help." Up close, she could see that his eyes were not just gray but had flecks of blue in them, like a clear sky trying to break through storm clouds. There was a wildness to him, an untamed quality that should have frightened her, but instead she felt inexplicably safe in his presence. "Are you hurt?" His voice was gentler now, though still deep enough to resonate in her chest. "No, just embarrassed." She clutched her basket tighter. "I am sorry you had to witness that." "You have nothing to be sorry for. Those men are cowards." He studied her face for a moment, and Evangeline wondered what he saw there. "My name is Josiah Brennan. I have a cabin up in the mountains, come down for supplies." "Evangeline Reed." She hesitated, then added, "I live on the west side of the river." Something flickered in his expression, but it was not the disgust or condescension she was used to seeing. If anything, he looked angry on her behalf. "The way they talk to you is that common." Evangeline looked down at her worn boots. "I was born there. My mother worked in the saloons. That is all people see when they look at me, no matter what I do." "Then they are fools," Josiah said simply. "I have been living in these mountains for 5 years now, and I learned pretty quick that a person's character has nothing to do with where they are born. It has to do with the choices they make." The kindness in his words brought unexpected tears to Evangeline's eyes, and she blinked them back furiously. She could not remember the last time someone had defended her, had suggested that she might be worth something. "That is a nice sentiment, but it does not change reality. I should get home before dark." She started to move past him, but Josiah spoke again. "Wait. If those men have been bothering you, if anyone gives you trouble, my camp is up Blacktail Creek, about 5 miles north. You follow the creek up into the canyon, you will find my cabin. You ever need help, you come find me." Evangeline turned back, surprised. "You would help me? You do not even know me." "I know enough." Josiah's jaw tightened beneath his beard. "I know you did not deserve what just happened, and I know this town ought to be ashamed of itself for allowing it. A woman should not have to fear walking down the street in daylight." For a moment, Evangeline could not speak around the lump in her throat. Finally, she managed, "Thank you, Mr. Brennan." "That is very kind. Just Josiah." He nodded to her, then stepped back. "You be careful getting home, Miss Reed." Evangeline watched him walk toward the general store, his buckskin-clad form drawing stares from everyone on the street. Then she hurried across the bridge to the west side, her heart beating strangely fast in her chest. She told herself, It was just the lingering fear from her encounter with the Sawyer brothers, but she knew that was not entirely true. Something about Josiah Brennan had stirred something inside her, some feeling she could not quite name. The next 2 weeks passed in their usual grinding routine. Evangeline took in what work she could find, though it was less and less as word spread about her supposed rudeness to Mrs. Pemberton. She supplemented her meager income by fishing in the river and foraging for wild vegetables and berries in the woods near her cabin. It was a hard life, but it was honest, and she took pride in that even when her stomach growled with hunger. She thought about Josiah more than she wanted to admit. At night, lying in her narrow bed, she remembered the way he had stood up for her, the anger in his voice when he called the Sawyer brothers cowards. No one had ever defended her like that. She wondered what he was doing up in his mountain cabin, wondered if he was lonely, wondered if he ever thought about the woman he had helped in town. Then came the day that changed everything. Evangeline had gone to the east side to deliver some mending to the seamstress, Miss Barton, who was one of the few people willing to give her work. She was crossing back over the bridge, her payment of a few coins clutched in her hand when she heard shouting ahead. A crowd had gathered near the saloons on the west side, and as Evangeline drew closer, her blood ran cold fire. One of the cabins was burning, flames licking up the dry wooden walls and reaching for the roof. People were running with buckets, trying to form a chain to the river, but the fire was spreading fast. Evangeline started to run, then froze as she realized which cabin it was, Old Tom's place. And Old Tom was crippled with arthritis, could barely walk. Was he inside? Is anyone in there? She shouted to the nearest person, a miner she recognized from the claims upstream. "Old Tom," the man yelled back. "He went in for his strongbox, has not come back out." Without thinking, without considering the danger, Evangeline dropped her basket and ran toward the burning cabin. She heard people shouting at her to stop, but she ignored them. Old Tom had been kind to her when kindness was rare. He always paid fairly when she mended his clothes, always tipped his hat to her on the street. She could not let him die. The heat hit her like a wall as she reached the door. Smoke poured out, thick and choking. Evangeline pulled her shawl up over her nose and mouth and plunged inside. The interior was an inferno. She could barely see through the smoke, could barely breathe. She dropped to her knees where the air was clearer and crawled forward, calling out, "Tom, Tom, where are you?" A groan came from her left. She crawled toward it and found the old man collapsed on the floor, his strongbox clutched to his chest. He must have been overcome by the smoke. Evangeline grabbed his arm and tried to pull him toward the door, but he was too heavy, and she was already dizzy from the smoke. The heat was unbearable. Above her, she heard an ominous cracking sound. The roof was going to collapse. She pulled harder, desperate now, but black spots were dancing in her vision. This was it, she realized with strange clarity. She was going to die in this burning cabin. At least she had tried to do something good. Then, through the smoke and flames, a massive figure appeared. Strong arms lifted her bodily off the floor. She tried to protest, to tell him about Old Tom, but she could not catch her breath to speak. She felt herself being carried, felt the cooler air hit her face as they burst out of the cabin, and then she was being set down on the ground well away from the fire. Evangeline gasped for air, coughing violently. Her eyes were streaming, her lungs burning. When her vision cleared, she saw Josiah Brennan beside her, already turning back toward the flames. Before she could stop him, he disappeared into the smoke again. The crowd held its breath. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Then Josiah emerged once more, this time carrying Old Tom over his shoulder like the man weighed nothing. He made it 10 feet from the cabin before the roof collapsed inward with a roar of flames and sparks. People rushed forward to help. Someone brought water for Old Tom, who was coughing but alive. Someone else wrapped a blanket around Evangeline's shoulders. But she only had eyes for Josiah, who was bent over with his hands on his knees, catching his breath. Soot covered his face and hands, and there were scorch marks on his buckskins. When he straightened and their eyes met, the intensity of his gaze made her heart stutter. He crossed to her in 3 long strides and dropped to one knee beside her. "What the hell were you thinking?" His voice was rough with smoke and something that sounded like fear. "You could have died in there." "So could you," Evangeline shot back, then dissolved into another coughing fit. When she could speak again, she said, "Tom needed help. I could not just let him burn." "That is why there are men, why there are people stronger than you." Josiah reached out as if to touch her face, then stopped himself. His hand fell to his side. "You are lucky you did not get yourself killed. She saved my life," old Tom croaked from where he lay nearby. "That girl ran in there when nobody else would, bravest thing I ever seen." People around them were murmuring now, looking at Evangeline with something other than contempt for the first time. But she barely noticed. She was looking at Josiah, at the fear that still lingered in his gray-blue eyes, and something clicked into place inside her chest. "What are you doing here anyway?" she asked quietly. "I thought you stayed in the mountains. Was in town for supplies, saw the smoke," his jaw clenched. "Good thing I was." The West Side's unofficial leader, a grizzled prospector named Hank Morrison, came over then. "We owe you, Brennan. Tom would be dead without you, and you too, Evangeline. That was foolish but brave." Josiah stood up, his full height making Hank take a step back. She should not have had to risk her life because everyone else was too scared to help their neighbor. "This side of the river, you all claim to look after your own, but I did not see anyone else running into that fire." An uncomfortable silence fell. Hank's face reddened, but he could not argue. It was true. Evangeline felt Josiah's hand on her shoulder, warm and steady through the blanket. "Can you walk?" he asked her. "I think so." She let him help her to her feet, though her legs were shaky. The world tilted slightly, and Josiah's arm went around her waist, steadying her against his solid frame. "You are coming with me," he said, in a tone that brooked no argument. "You breathed in too much smoke. You need to rest somewhere safe, and I am guessing your cabin does not have much in the way of provisions." Evangeline wanted to protest, wanted to insist she would be fine, but the truth was she felt awful. Her lungs ached with every breath, and she was so tired she could barely stand. "I do not want to be a burden." "You are not a burden." Josiah looked at Hank. "Tell people she will be back when she is recovered. Anyone has a problem with that, they can take it up with me." Hank nodded slowly, and Evangeline saw new respect in his eyes as he looked at her. "You take care of yourself, girl. You did good today." Josiah led Evangeline to where his horse was tied outside the general store, a massive bay gelding that looked like it could carry a mountain. He swung into the saddle with easy grace, then reached down to lift Evangeline up in front of him as if she weighed no more than a child. She settled against his chest, feeling the solid strength of him behind her, his arms coming around her to hold the reins. "Hold on," he said quietly, his breath warm against her ear. They rode out of Timber Creek heading north, following Blacktail Creek up into the mountains. Evangeline drifted in and out of awareness, lulled by the steady rhythm of the horse's gait and the warmth of Josiah's body behind her. She was vaguely aware of the landscape changing around them, the cottonwoods along the creek giving way to pines and aspens, the valley narrowing into a canyon. When she opened her eyes fully again, they were in front of a sturdy log cabin set in a small clearing. The creek rushed past nearby, and beyond the cabin rose the towering peaks of the Rockies, their summits already dusted with early snow. Josiah dismounted and lifted her down carefully, keeping one arm around her when her knees buckled. "Easy now," he murmured. "Let us get you inside." The cabin's interior was simple but well-built, with a stone fireplace, a table and chairs he had clearly made himself, and a bed in one corner covered with thick furs. Josiah guided Evangeline to the bed and helped her sit down. "I am getting soot all over your furs," she protested weakly. "I do not care about the furs. I care about you breathing properly." He knelt in front of her, studying her face with a concerned expression. "How do your lungs feel?" "Like I breathed fire," Evangeline admitted, "but I will be fine." Josiah shook his head and stood up. "You are going to rest here tonight, probably longer. I am going to make you something to help with the smoke damage." Evangeline wanted to argue, but she was too exhausted. She watched as Josiah moved around the cabin with practiced efficiency, stoking the fire in the hearth and setting a kettle to boil. He pulled jars from a shelf and measured out dried herbs with surprising delicacy for such large hands. "You know medicine?" she asked. "Learned from the crow. Spent a winter with them a few years back when I first came to these mountains. They taught me what plants to use for what ailments." He brought her a cup filled with a steaming liquid that smelled of mint and something else she could not identify. "Drink this. It will help clear your lungs." The tea was bitter but soothing. Evangeline sipped it slowly, feeling warmth spread through her chest. Josiah sat in one of the chairs he had pulled over, watching her with those storm-colored eyes. "Why did you run into that fire?" He asked finally. "You must have known how dangerous it was. Old Tom has always been kind to me. He treated me like a person, not like trash from the wrong side of the river." Evangeline stared down into her cup. "I suppose I wanted to prove I was worth his kindness, and I could not just let him die when I might be able to help." "You have a brave heart," Josiah said quietly. "Foolish sometimes, maybe, but brave," says the man who ran in after me. Evangeline looked up at him, really studying his face for the first time. Beneath the beard and the weathered skin, he was younger than she had initially thought, probably no more than 27 or 28. "Why did you do that?" Something shifted in Josiah's expression, a vulnerability she had not seen before. "Because the thought of you dying in there was unbearable. I have only met you once, but I have been thinking about you ever since. The way those men treated you, the way this whole damned town treats you, it made me angry. Made me want to do something about it." Evangeline's heart was beating fast again, but this time it had nothing to do with fear or smoke inhalation. "You have been thinking about me every day." Josiah leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I know I have no right to say that. I am just a mountain man, barely civilized according to most people. But there was something about you, about the dignity you held on to even when those bastards were trying to tear you down. I could not get you out of my head." "I have been thinking about you too," Evangeline confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "You were the first person in longer than I can remember who made me feel like I mattered, like I was worth defending." The silence that fell between them was charged with possibility. Josiah reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. When she did not move, his calloused fingers brushed her cheek with surprising gentleness. "You matter," he said roughly. "You matter a whole hell of a lot, and if you will let me, I would like to show you what it is like to be valued the way you deserve." Tears spilled down Evangeline's cheeks before she could stop them. She set the cup aside and reached for Josiah's hand, lacing her smoke-stained fingers through his. "I do not understand why you would want to bother with someone like me. I have nothing to offer you. I am nobody." "You are not nobody." Josiah's grip on her hand tightened. "You are a woman who risks her life to save others, who works herself to the bone to maintain her dignity and independence, who refuses to let the cruelty of small-minded people break her. You are stronger than half the men I have met and braver than most. Do not you ever call yourself nobody again." A sob broke from Evangeline's throat, and then Josiah was pulling her into his arms, holding her as she cried. He was so solid, so warm, and she felt safer than she had in years. His hand stroked her hair, gentle despite his strength, and he murmured quiet reassurances until her tears slowed. "I am sorry," she said when she could speak again, pulling back to wipe at her face. "I did not mean to fall apart like that. You have nothing to apologize for. You nearly died today. You are allowed to fall apart." Josiah tucked a strand of her dark hair behind her ear. "You are also exhausted. You need to sleep. You take the bed and I will make a pallet by the fire." "I cannot take your bed. You can and you will." He stood up, and there was a note of authority in his voice that made it clear arguing would be useless. "I have slept on worse than a floor. You need to recover." Evangeline was too tired to fight him. She lay back on the furs, and Josiah pulled a blanket over her. The last thing she remembered before sleep claimed her was the sight of him settling by the fire, his broad back to her, keeping watch like a guardian standing between her and the rest of the world. When Evangeline woke, sunlight was streaming through the cabin's windows, and the smell of cooking meat made her stomach clench with hunger. She sat up carefully, relieved to find that her lungs felt much better, though still tender. Josiah was at the hearth, tending to a pot that hung over the fire. "How long did I sleep?" she asked, her voice hoarse. Josiah turned and his face relaxed into a small smile when he saw her awake. "About 12 hours. It is mid-morning. How do you feel?" "Better." She swung her legs out of bed and stood, pleased when the world stayed steady. "Much better, actually." "Good, come eat something. You probably have not had a proper meal in a while." He was right about that. Evangeline could not remember the last time she had eaten meat. She sat at the table, and Josiah ladled stew into a bowl for her. The venison was tender and flavorful, with wild onions and root vegetables, and she had to force herself not to devour it too quickly. "This is wonderful," she said between bites. "Where did you learn to cook?" "Out of necessity." Josiah sat across from her with his own bowl. "When you live alone in the mountains, you either learn to cook or you starve. I got pretty good at making do with what I can hunt and gather." Evangeline looked around the cabin, really taking it in for the first time. Everything was well crafted and organized, from the shelves lined with preserved food to the neatly stacked firewood to the collection of tools hanging on the wall. "You have built a good life here." "I have built a peaceful life," Josiah corrected. "Good is subjective. It is lonely sometimes." "Is that why you came to these mountains, to be alone?" Josiah was quiet for a moment, stirring his stew. "I came because I did not fit anywhere else. I grew up in Missouri, worked on my father's farm until the war came. Fought for the Union, saw things I wish I could forget. When I came back, I could not settle into ordinary life again. The farm felt too small, the town too crowded. Every loud noise made me jump. I needed space, needed silence, so I headed west and kept going until I found these mountains. Do you have any family back in Missouri? My parents died of cholera during the war. I had a sister, but she married and moved to Ohio. We write occasionally, but we are not close." He looked up at her. "What about you? You said your mother died when you were 7. Your father?" "I never knew him. My mother would not speak of him." Evangeline pushed her stew around with her spoon. "I used to imagine he was someone important, someone who would come and rescue me from the West Side. Childish dreams. The truth is he was probably just another miner who paid for my mother's company and moved on. That must have been hard, growing up without parents, with everyone judging you. Mrs. Hartley made it bearable. She was the closest thing to a mother I had. When she died, I felt like I lost my only anchor in the world." Evangeline met Josiah's eyes. "Until yesterday, I do not think anyone had made me feel valued since she passed." Josiah reached across the table and took her hand. "Stay here with me for a while, rest, recover properly. Let me show you what it is like not to have to fight for every scrap of respect." Evangeline's breath caught. "I cannot just stay here. What would people say?" Who cares what they say? They already judge you unfairly. At least here you would be safe, well-fed, treated with kindness. His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. I am not going to pretend I do not have selfish reasons. I want you here. I want to know you better. But more than that, I want you to have a chance to rest, to not have to struggle every day just to survive. It was tempting, so tempting. But Evangeline had spent her whole life trying to prove she was respectable, that she was not what people assumed. Running off to live with a mountain man, even temporarily, would destroy what little reputation she had left. As if reading her thoughts, Josiah said, I know what you are thinking. You are worried about your reputation. But Evangeline, your reputation is already ruined through no fault of your own. You could be a saint, and those people would still see you as trash from the wrong side of the river. Maybe it is time to stop caring what they think and start caring about what you want. What if I do not know what I want? Then stay here and figure it out. No pressure, no expectations, just rest and time to breathe. He squeezed her hand gently. I give you my word as a gentleman that I will not take advantage. You will have the bed, I will sleep by the fire. If you decide you want to go back to town, I will take you whenever you ask. Evangeline looked around the cabin again, then out the window at the mountains rising beyond. For the first time in forever, she felt something unfurling in her chest, something that might have been hope. Maybe just a few days, she heard herself say, to recover fully. The smile that spread across Josiah's bearded face transformed him, made him look younger and almost boyish despite his size. A few days then, we will see how it goes. Those few days stretched into a week, then two. Evangeline discovered that life with Josiah was unlike anything she had experienced. He treated her as an equal, asking her opinions, listening when she spoke, helping with chores without being asked. They fell into an easy rhythm, working side by side during the day and talking by the fire at night. Josiah taught her things she had never known, showing her how to identify edible plants in the forest, how to fish the creek using methods the crow had taught him, how to read the signs of changing weather in the sky. In turn, Evangeline introduced refinements to his cabin life, making curtains from spare cloth to soften the windows, organizing his shelves more efficiently, teaching him the song's misses. Hartley had taught her, but more than the practical sharing of knowledge, they talked. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing stories of their pasts, their dreams, their fears. Evangeline told him about the books she had read, the ones Mrs. Hartley had owned, and the ones she had borrowed from the town library before the librarian had decided she was not welcome there. Josiah spoke of the war, the things that still haunted him, the reasons he sometimes woke in the night reaching for weapons that were not there. It gets easier, he told her one evening as they sat outside watching the stars emerge over the mountains. Being up here, away from everything, the nightmares are less frequent. The peace of these mountains, it heals something inside. I can understand that, Evangeline said softly. She was wrapped in one of Josiah's heavy coats, sitting on a log while he stood nearby, his face turned toward the peaks. Being here with you, it is the first time I have felt like I can truly breathe, like I do not have to constantly guard myself against the next insult or slight. Josiah turned to look at her, and even in the gathering darkness, she could see the intensity in his expression. You never have to guard yourself with me, Evangeline. You are safe here. You will always be safe with me. The certainty in his voice made her heart ache. She had been fighting her growing feelings for him, trying to convince herself that this was temporary, that she would eventually have to return to her real life. But the truth was she did not want to go back. She wanted to stay here in this cabin with this man who looked at her like she was something precious. Josiah, she began, then stopped, not sure how to put her feelings into words. He crossed to her and knelt down so they were eye to eye. What is it? I do not want to leave, she admitted. I know I should. I know staying here is probably foolish, but I have never been happier than I have been these past 2 weeks. You make me feel like I matter, like I am worth something. When you look at me, you do not see the girl from the wrong side of the river. You just see me. That is because there is nothing wrong with where you come from, Josiah said fiercely. The wrong is in the people who judge you for it. You are brave and strong and kind and beautiful, and anyone who cannot see that is a fool. You think I am beautiful. The words came out as a whisper. God, yes. Josiah's hand came up to cup her face, his touch gentle despite the calluses on his palm. You are the most beautiful woman I have ever seen. Not just your face, though that takes my breath away. But your spirit, your determination, the way you refuse to let the world break you, everything about you is beautiful. Evangeline could not breathe, could not think. All she could do was feel the warmth of his hand on her cheek, see the truth of his words in his eyes. I am falling in love with you, she said, the admission torn from somewhere deep inside her. I tried not to, I tried to protect myself, but I cannot help it. Thank God, Josiah breathed, and then he was kissing her. His lips were warm and gentle at first, questioning, giving her every chance to pull away. When she did not, when instead she leaned into him and wrapped her arms around his neck, the kiss deepened. Evangeline had been kissed before, quick stolen kisses from boys who thought her easy because of where she lived, kisses that had left her feeling dirty and ashamed. This was nothing like that. This kiss was full of tenderness and passion, a claiming and a promise all at once. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Josiah rested his forehead against hers. I love you, he said roughly. I have loved you since the first day I saw you, trying so hard to hold your head high while those bastards tore you down. You have been in my heart ever since. Stay with me, Evangeline, not just for a few days. Stay for good. Be with me. Yes, Evangeline said, tears streaming down her face, but they were happy tears this time. Yes, I will stay. I will be with you. I love you, Josiah. He kissed her again, then lifted her into his arms and carried her back into the cabin. He set her down gently near the fire and looked at her with a mixture of love and desire that made her blood heat. I want you to be my wife, he said. Properly, legally. I want everyone to know you are mine and I am yours. But I will not push you, will not ask you to do anything you are not ready for. We can wait as long as you need. Evangeline thought about the life she had left behind, the constant struggle and judgment, the loneliness. Then she thought about the life she could have here, with this man who valued her, protected her, loved her. There was no contest. I do not want to wait, she said, stepping close to him and placing her hands on his broad chest. I have spent my whole life waiting for my real life to begin. It begins now with you. That night, they came together with a passion and tenderness that left Evangeline shaking in Josiah's arms. He was gentle with her, careful of her inexperience, making sure she felt nothing but pleasure and love. Afterward, lying in his bed with his strong arms around her and his heartbeat steady beneath her ear, Evangeline felt more complete than she ever had in her life. We will go to town tomorrow, Josiah murmured into her hair. Find a preacher to marry us properly. I want the whole world to know you are mine. Do you think anyone will perform the ceremony? Evangeline asked quietly. I am still the girl from the wrong side of the river. If the preacher in Timber Creek will not do it, we will ride to the next town and the next, until we find someone who will. I will not let their small-mindedness keep me from marrying you. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. Besides, after what you did, running into that fire to save old Tom, people have been talking. Maybe not all the talk is bad anymore. Evangeline wanted to believe that, but years of rejection had made her wary. Still, with Josiah beside her, she felt brave enough to face whatever came. They rode into Timber Creek the next afternoon. Evangeline sitting in front of Josiah on his bay gelding, his arms secure around her. She had borrowed one of his shirts and a pair of his pants, rolled up and belted to fit her smaller frame, since her dress had been ruined by smoke and soot. It felt strange to be wearing men's clothing, but also oddly freeing. As they rode down the main street toward the small church at the end of town, Evangeline was aware of people stopping to stare. She lifted her chin, refusing to show shame or fear. Josiah's presence behind her was like a wall of strength she could lean against. They tied the horse outside the church and found Reverend Michaels in his small office, writing notes for Sunday's sermon. The Reverend looked up in surprise when they entered, his gaze moving from Josiah to Evangeline and back again. "Mr. Brennan, Miss Reed, what can I do for you?" "We want to get married," Josiah said bluntly. "Today, if possible, tomorrow if not." Reverend Michaels's eyebrows rose. He was a relatively young man, only a few years older than Josiah, and he had always seemed more open-minded than most of the townspeople. "That is quite sudden." "May I ask how long you have been courting?" "A few weeks," Josiah said. "But I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I love her and I want her as my wife." The Reverend looked at Evangeline. "And you, Miss Reed, is this what you want?" "Yes," Evangeline said firmly. "I love Josiah and I want to marry him." Reverend Michaels was quiet for a moment, studying them both. Then he nodded slowly. "Very well. I can perform the ceremony tomorrow after morning services. You will need witnesses." "Do you have anyone in mind?" "We will find someone," Josiah said. They left the church and walked toward the general store to buy supplies for the cabin. People watched them go by, and Evangeline heard whispers. Some were clearly disapproving, but others sounded almost approving. A few people even nodded to them respectfully. Inside the general store, the owner, Mr. Patterson, greeted them with unusual friendliness. "Heard what you did, Miss Reed, running into that fire for old Tom. Brave thing, very brave. And you too, Brennan, pulling them both out. Town owes you both a debt." "We were just doing what was right," Josiah said. "Anyone would have done the same." "But they did not, did they? You two did." Mr. Patterson began pulling items from the shelves as Josiah listed what they needed. "Heard you two are getting married tomorrow. Congratulations." Word traveled fast in a small town. Evangeline managed to smile. "Thank you." As they were loading their supplies, a familiar figure approached. Old Tom, leaning heavily on a cane but otherwise looking well, made his way over to them. His weathered face split into a wide grin when he saw Evangeline. "There she is, my angel of mercy," he said warmly. "I've been wanting to thank you, proper girl. You saved my life, no two ways about it." "I am glad you are all right, Tom," Evangeline said sincerely. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got cooked over a spit, but I am alive, and that is thanks to you." He looked at Josiah. "You too, Brennan. Heard you two are tying the knot. That is wonderful news. You need witnesses. I would be honored to stand up for you." Josiah smiled. "We would like that, Tom, thank you." As they finished their shopping and prepared to leave, Mrs. Pemberton, the banker's wife who had refused to pay Evangeline for her work, approached them. Evangeline tensed, expecting more rudeness, but the woman surprised her. "Miss Reed, I owe you an apology," Mrs. Pemberton said stiffly. "I treated you poorly, and it was wrong of me. What you did, saving Tom, showed your true character. I should have seen it before. I am sorry." It was not a warm or effusive apology, but it was clearly genuine, and it cost the proud woman something to offer it. Evangeline found herself softening. "Thank you, Mrs. Pemberton. I appreciate that." The woman nodded and hurried away, and Evangeline turned to Josiah with wide eyes. "Did that just happen? People can surprise you sometimes," Josiah said, taking her hand. "Maybe you running into that fire showed them what I already knew, that you are worth 100 of them." They returned to the cabin that evening with their supplies, and the good news that they had a witness for their wedding. Evangeline spent the night in Josiah's arms again, and the next morning they dressed in their best clothes. Josiah wore clean buckskins and a shirt he had been saving, and Evangeline wore a simple blue dress that had been Mrs. Hartley's, one of the few nice things she owned. They rode to town in the late morning, arriving at the church to find a surprise waiting. Old Tom was there as promised, but he was not alone. Hank Morrison stood with him, along with a dozen other residents of the west side of the river. They broke into applause when Josiah and Evangeline dismounted. "Could not let one of our own get married without a proper send-off," Hank said gruffly. "You did us proud, girl. We wanted to be here for you." Tears stung Evangeline's eyes. These were her people, the ones she had grown up among, and they had come to support her. It meant more than she could say. Inside the church, Reverend Michaels performed a simple but heartfelt ceremony. When it came time to exchange vows, Josiah took both of Evangeline's hands in his and spoke from the heart. "Evangeline, from the moment I met you, I knew you were special. You have shown me what true courage looks like, what true strength is. You have filled my lonely life with light and love. I promise to protect you, to cherish you, to stand by your side against anything the world throws at us. I will love you until my last breath and beyond." Evangeline could barely speak through her tears, but she managed to say her own vows. "Josiah, you saw me when everyone else looked through me. You valued me when the world said I was worthless. You gave me hope when I had none left. I promise to love you with everything I am, to be your partner and your friend, to stand with you in all things. You are my home, and I will love you forever." When Reverend Michaels pronounced them man and wife and told Josiah he could kiss his bride, the kiss they shared was sweet and full of promise. The small congregation erupted in applause and cheers. After the ceremony, there was an impromptu celebration outside the church. Someone had brought a fiddle, and someone else produced a jug of whiskey. People from both sides of the river mingled, united in celebration of the unlikely couple. Even some of the East Side residents who had always looked down on Evangeline came to offer stiff but genuine congratulations. As the sun began to set and the celebration wound down, Josiah and Evangeline prepared to ride back to their mountain cabin. Old Tom caught Evangeline's arm before she could mount the horse. "You be happy, girl," he said quietly. "You deserve it more than anyone I know, and do not you ever forget that you are worth 10 of those fancy ladies who turned their noses up at you." "Thank you, Tom, for everything." Evangeline hugged him carefully, mindful of his injuries. Then she was in the saddle in front of Josiah, his arms around her, and they were riding away from Timber Creek toward their home. As the town disappeared behind them and the mountains rose ahead, Evangeline leaned back against her husband's solid chest and smiled. "Are you happy?" Josiah asked softly. "I have never been happier in my life," Evangeline answered honestly. "For the first time, I feel like I am exactly where I am supposed to be, good. Because I plan to spend the rest of my life making sure you stay that happy." They rode through the gathering dusk, two people who had found each other against all odds, heading home to the life they would build together. The first winter of their marriage was harsh, with snow falling heavy and deep in the mountains. But inside the cabin, Evangeline and Josiah were warm and content. They spent long evenings by the fire, Josiah carving or repairing equipment, while Evangeline sewed or read aloud from the small collection of books she had brought from her old cabin. Josiah had gone back to retrieve her belongings one day while she stayed at the cabin, and he had returned with everything she owned loaded onto his horse. It was not much, but it meant she had fully moved into her new life. The old cabin on the west side of the river was empty now, and Evangeline felt no sadness about leaving it behind. She learned more about surviving in the wilderness during those winter months. Josiah taught her to tan hides, to make candles from animal fat, to preserve meat and vegetables. He showed her how to use snowshoes and how to track animals through the snow. In turn, she brought comfort and companionship to his once lonely existence. The cabin that had been merely a shelter became a home, filled with warmth and laughter and love. When spring came, melting the snow and turning the mountain meadows green, Evangeline discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected it for a few weeks, but had not been certain until the morning sickness started. When she told Josiah, he swept her up in his arms and spun her around, laughing with pure joy. "A baby," he said, setting her down carefully and placing his large hand on her still flat stomach. "Our baby. Evangeline, you have made me the happiest man alive. You are not worried?" she asked. "About the responsibility, about another mouth to feed?" "Not even a little. We will manage fine. I have been trapping these mountains for years, and I know every good hunting spot. We have the garden we are planting, and I can always take pelts to town to trade for what we need." He kissed her forehead. "Our child will have everything they need, especially love. They will never doubt they are wanted, never have to wonder if they matter." Evangeline thought about her own childhood, about being unwanted and judged from the moment she was born. "No," she agreed softly, "our child will always know they are loved." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer and into the fall. Evangeline's belly grew round and full, and she felt the baby moving inside her, little flutters that became strong kicks. Josiah was constantly attentive, insisting she rest more, taking over the heavier chores, talking to her belly and telling their unborn child about the mountains and forests that would be their home. When the first snows of winter began to fall again, Evangeline went into labor. It was a long, difficult process, and there were moments when she thought she could not continue. But Josiah was beside her the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her brow, encouraging her with words of love and strength. He had helped animals give birth, and had a calm, steady presence that helped her get through the worst of the pain. Finally, as dawn broke over the mountains, their son entered the world with a lusty cry. Josiah cut the cord with shaking hands and wrapped the baby in soft furs, before placing him in Evangeline's arms. She looked down at the tiny, red face and felt her heart expand with a love so fierce it took her breath away. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We have been waiting for you." "He is perfect," Josiah said hoarsely, tears streaming down his face. "Look at him, Evangeline. We made this perfect little person." They named him Daniel, after Josiah's father. He had his father's dark hair and his mother's delicate features, and from the start, he was loved beyond measure. Josiah proved to be a devoted father, learning to change swaddling cloths and soothe the baby's cries with the same efficiency he brought to everything else. At night, Evangeline would wake to find him standing by the cradle he had built, just watching their son sleep with an expression of wonder on his face. The people of Timber Creek were surprised, but pleased when Josiah brought his family to town for supplies a few months after Daniel's birth. Women clustered around to admire the baby, and Evangeline found herself welcomed in a way she never had been before. Marriage to Josiah and motherhood seemed to have finally given her the respectability she had craved, though now that she had it, she realized it mattered less than she had thought. What mattered was the love in her home, the family she and Josiah had created. Still, it was nice to walk down the street without fear of insults. It was nice to have women ask her advice about sewing or preserving food, to be included in conversations instead of excluded. The incident with the fire had changed how people saw her, and marrying Josiah had cemented that change. She was no longer trash from the wrong side of the river. She was Mrs. Brennan, wife of the respected mountain man who had saved old Tom's life. As Daniel grew from an infant into a toddler, Evangeline and Josiah's life fell into a comfortable rhythm. Summers were spent tending their large garden and gathering wild foods. Falls were for hunting and preserving meat for winter. Winters were for staying warm and safe in their cabin, and springs were for renewal and preparation. They made trips to town every few months for supplies and to maintain connections with the community, but the mountains were their true home. When Daniel was 3, Evangeline became pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect. Their second child, a daughter they named Rose after Josiah's mother, came into the world on a beautiful spring morning with the meadow flowers blooming outside the cabin windows. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubbornness, and she completed their family in a way Evangeline had not even known was missing. The years passed in a blur of love and laughter and hard work. Daniel grew into a strong, curious boy who followed his father everywhere, learning to track and hunt and survive in the wilderness. Rose was equally adventurous, but had inherited her mother's love of books and learning. Josiah made sure both children could read and write, using the Bible and the few other books they owned as teaching tools. They made more trips to town as the children grew older, and Evangeline was pleased to see that Daniel and Rose were accepted without question by the other children. They were not judged by where their mother had been born or what side of which river she had come from. They were simply the Brennan children, beloved by their parents and welcomed by the community. One summer day when Daniel was 10 and Rose was 7, they all rode to town for the Independence Day celebration. Timber Creek had grown over the years, with new businesses opening and more families moving in. The town square was decorated with bunting and flags, and there were games and races for the children. Evangeline stood with a group of women watching the children play when Mrs. Pemberton approached her. The banker's wife was older now, graying at the temples, but she had mellowed over the years. She and Evangeline had developed an unlikely friendship built on mutual respect if not warmth. "Your children are lovely, Evangeline," Mrs. Pemberton said. "You and Josiah have done well with them." "Thank you, they are good children." Evangeline watched Daniel help Rose with the sack race, making sure she did not fall. "We are very blessed." "You know, I have been thinking lately about that day when you ran into the fire to save old Tom," Mrs. Pemberton said quietly. "It was the bravest thing I had ever seen, and it shamed me. I had treated you so poorly, and there you were, risking your life for someone else. It changed how I saw many things." "That was a long time ago," Evangeline said gently. "It was. But I wanted you to know that I admire you. You took a hard life and made it into something beautiful. You could have become bitter, but instead you became strong." Mrs. Pemberton paused. "I am glad you found happiness with Josiah. You deserve it." "Thank you," Evangeline said, genuinely touched. "That means a great deal." As the sun set and the celebration wound down, the Brennan family rode back to their mountain home. Daniel and Rose were tired and happy, chattering about the games they had played and the friends they had seen. Josiah reached over and squeezed Evangeline's hand, and she squeezed back, content in a way she had never imagined possible all those years ago when she was a lonely, judged girl on the wrong side of the river. That night, after the children were asleep in their loft, Evangeline and Josiah sat outside on the porch Josiah had built, looking up at the stars. The night was warm and clear, and the creek rushed by with its constant soothing sound. "Do you ever regret it?" Evangeline asked quietly. "Marrying me, taking on the responsibility of a family. You could have stayed alone up here, lived an easier life." Josiah turned to her with surprise clear on his face. "Regret? Evangeline, loving you and our children is the best thing I have ever done. Before you, I was just existing, not truly living. You gave me purpose and joy. How could I ever regret that?" I just worry sometimes that I trapped you, that you felt obligated to help me because of how people treated me. Look at me, Josiah said, and she turned to meet his eyes. I chose you, Evangeline. Not out of obligation, not out of pity. I chose you because I fell in love with you the first time I saw you standing up to those bastards with your head held high. I chose you because you are brave and strong and kind. I chose you because my life is infinitely better with you in it. Do not ever doubt that. Evangeline felt tears prick her eyes. I love you so much, she whispered. Sometimes it scares me how much I love you. Good, Josiah said, pulling her close, because I love you just as fiercely. You and our children are everything to me. This life we have built, it is everything I never knew I needed. They sat together under the stars, and Evangeline reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She thought about the lonely girl she had been, judged and rejected by a narrow-minded town. She thought about the day Josiah had stood up for her, the day he had carried her away from that burning cabin and into a new life. She thought about the moment he had lifted her onto his horse and brought her to this mountain home, carrying her over to his side gladly when no one else would have done the same. In a very real way, Josiah had carried her from one side of the river to the other, from a life of judgment and struggle to a life of love and acceptance. He had seen her worth when no one else would, had valued her when the world said she was worthless. And in doing so, he had given her the greatest gift anyone could offer, the chance to be truly, completely happy. The years continued to pass. Daniel grew into a young man, tall and strong like his father, with a natural talent for tracking and hunting. Rose blossomed into a thoughtful, intelligent young woman who loved reading and could often be found with a book in her hands. Both children grew up secure in their parents' love, never doubting their place in the world. When Daniel was 20, he began courting the daughter of the general store owner in Timber Creek. Josiah and Evangeline watched with pride as their son fell in love, remembering their own courtship. The wedding was held in the same church where Josiah and Evangeline had married, and Reverend Michaels, now white-haired and stooped, performed the ceremony. It was a joyful occasion, bringing together the mountain community and the townspeople in celebration. 2 years later, Rose met a young teacher who had come west to establish a school in a neighboring town. He was educated and kind, and he looked at Rose the way Josiah looked at Evangeline, with complete devotion. Their courtship was brief but intense, and soon there was another wedding to celebrate. As both children established homes and families of their own, Josiah and Evangeline found themselves alone in their mountain cabin once more, but it was a different kind of alone than before. They were grandparents now, with grandchildren who visited regularly and filled the cabin with noise and laughter before returning to their own homes. They had built a legacy of love, had created a family that was strong and secure. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sun set over the mountains, Evangeline took Josiah's weathered hand in hers. They were both in their 50s now, their hair graying, their faces lined with years of hard work and mountain weather. But the love between them burned as strong as ever. "Do you remember the day we met?" Evangeline asked. "When those Sawyer brothers were harassing me and you stepped in?" "I remember everything about that day," Josiah said. "I remember thinking you were the bravest, most beautiful woman I had ever seen. I remember wanting to protect you to show you what you deserved. You did more than that. You saved me, Josiah. Not just from those men that day, but from a life of loneliness and judgment. You carried me over to your side when no one else would have bothered." Evangeline leaned her head on his shoulder. "You gave me everything I never even knew to hope for. You saved me too," Josiah said quietly. "I was so lost before you came into my life. I thought isolation was what I needed, but what I really needed was someone to share my life with. someone who understood what it was to be judged unfairly, who had fought their own battles. "You made my life worth living." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge, the same stars they had watched together for so many years. The creek rushed by with its endless song, and somewhere in the forest, an owl called. This was their home, their sanctuary, the place where they had built a life together against all odds. "I would do it all again," Evangeline said softly. "Every hard moment, every struggle, if it meant ending up here with you." "So would I," Josiah agreed, 1,000 times over. As night fell fully over the mountains, they rose and went inside their cabin, closing the door on the darkness but not on their life. Their story was not one of dramatic adventures or grand gestures beyond that first day, when Josiah had defended Evangeline and carried her away to safety. Instead, it was a story of quiet devotion, of two people choosing each other every day, of building something lasting and beautiful from unpromising beginnings. In the end, it did not matter that Evangeline had been born on the wrong side of the river. What mattered was that she had found someone who saw past artificial boundaries and social judgments to the person she truly was. What mattered was that Josiah had been strong enough and brave enough to carry her over to his side gladly, to claim her as his own despite what anyone else thought. They had built a life together in these mountains, raised children who knew nothing of the prejudice that had once defined Evangeline's existence, created a legacy of love that would extend through generations. The girl who had once been judged as worthless because of where she was born had become a woman of value, not because she had changed but because someone had finally recognized her worth. And the mountain man who had once thought isolation was his only path to peace had discovered that true peace came from opening his heart and his home to someone who needed both. Together, they had found what they had been searching for without even knowing they were searching: a partner, a home, a love that would last through all the years of their lives. As they prepared for bed that night, moving through the familiar routines of decades of marriage, Evangeline caught Josiah watching her with that same look of love and devotion he had worn on their wedding day. She smiled at him, her heart full to bursting. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That I am the luckiest man who ever lived," Josiah said simply. "That is what I am thinking." "We are both lucky," Evangeline corrected. "We found each other." "We did," Josiah agreed, "and I will be grateful for that every day for the rest of my life." They climbed into bed, the same bed where their children had been conceived, where they had comforted each other through illness and grief, where they had celebrated joys and weathered sorrows. Josiah pulled Evangeline close, and she nestled against his solid warmth, feeling safe and loved and completely content. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, and the creek sang its endless song. Inside, two hearts beat in rhythm, two souls intertwined so completely that it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. They had traveled far from that day in Timber Creek when judgment and prejudice had tried to define them. They had built something beautiful from pain and rejection. And as sleep claimed them both, Evangeline's last conscious thought was one of gratitude. Gratitude for the fire that had brought them together, for the courage to accept love when it was offered, for the man who had seen her worth when no one else would. She had been born on the wrong side of the river, but Josiah had carried her over to his side gladly, and in doing so had given her the only thing that truly mattered: a home where she was valued, cherished, and loved beyond measure. Their story was one of triumph, not over external enemies or great obstacles, but over the small-minded prejudice that sought to define people by circumstances beyond their control. It was a story of love conquering judgment, of kindness overcoming cruelty, of two lonely souls finding completeness in each other. And it was a story that would live on through their children and grandchildren, a testament to the power of seeing past surface judgments to the true value that lies within. The mountain man and the girl from the wrong side of the river had found their happily ever after, not in spite of their circumstances, but because they had chosen to create something better together. They had built a life of love and respect and partnership, and that life would be their greatest legacy, enduring long after they were gone. In the quiet darkness of their mountain cabin, surrounded by the peace they had fought so hard to find, Josiah and Evangeline Brennan slept, secure in their love and content in the knowledge that they had found exactly what they were meant to find: each other.